Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for January 17th, 2021. Continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. We are in the book of Genesis, noticing part 2 of the book. And this morning we come to Genesis chapter 37. This is lesson 7 in the book, if you're following along in it. And we're looking at Joseph the Dreamer, is what the author entitled this lesson. And once again, we're in Genesis chapter 37. The author looks at verses 1 through 22, and that's what we'll focus in on. If time allows, we will go past 22 as far as we can towards the end of the chapter. As we look at this, the author begins by introducing the lesson. He says, Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons. The first son born to Rachel, Jacob's favored wife. As such, he enjoyed a special relationship with his father. In fact, Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children. Because he was the son of his old age, also he made him a tunic of many colors. Genesis 37:3. Having been the favorite of one of his own parents, Jacob's treatment of Joseph may have seemed natural. Nevertheless, it caused problems between Joseph and his older brothers, who hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Right off the bat, as you look at this, the author here says that it might have seemed natural to Jacob because he had kind of the same situation with his mother. But if you think about it, you would think that that would have shown Jacob the folly and the danger of playing favorites with one's children. I mean, that's what everything that took place with Jacob and Esau, the stealing of the blessing that we noticed last week or a couple of weeks ago, and everything that took place after that, for Jacob was because of the favoritism that was shown by his parents. And so you would have thought that would have been a lesson to Jacob. And it should be a lesson to us of the danger of playing favorites in that way. The author goes on to say the conflict between Joseph and his brothers, however, was not the first to afflict Jacob's family, for it resembled the conflict that previously existed between their mothers, Rachel and Leah. After Leah bore 4 sons to Jacob, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Knowing the matter was beyond his control, Jacob responded, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you fruit of the womb?" Whether intentional or not, Jacob's question anticipated the birth of Joseph. Joseph used the same phrase after Jacob's death, when his brothers feared he might punish them for the evil way they treated him. He responded, "Do not be afraid, for I am in the place of God. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about, as it is this day, to save many people alive." Eventually, God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son, and said, "God has taken away my reproach." Although Joseph's birth is reported in Genesis 30, the narrative focusing upon his life begins in Genesis 37 and continues to the end of the book. It records the tension existing between Joseph and his brothers, the sale of Joseph into slavery, the intentional deception of Jacob regarding Joseph's whereabouts, Joseph's rise to second in rank in Egypt, the salvation of the family of Jacob from starvation, and the eventual relocation of Jacob's family to Egypt. Summarizing the biblical record of Joseph's life, Curavella wrote, "The focus of the narrative is upon Joseph, as one who brings life, the mediator of Yahweh's blessing to the rest of humanity. When everyone else is in dire need and dying of famine, Egypt under Joseph is the fount of life and food to which nations on the earth comes. He is the instrument of salvation, a fact Joseph himself is not unaware of. Thus Joseph's life is intricately tied in with his being the agents of God's blessing to the world. Both Joseph's family and the nation, as well as all the earth, are blessed by Yahweh through him." As we begin to consider the life of Joseph, he says, keep in mind the way God used his willing servant to accomplish his will. As you look at the life of Joseph, one of the things you see is it's a roller coaster ride for Joseph. Every time things seem to be going well for him, something happens and things go terribly wrong. And many times it's not anything that Joseph necessarily has done wrong. It's not any fault of him. It's the circumstances of life that he's found himself in. But one of the things that's always interesting as you study the life of Joseph is despite all of the ups and downs, Joseph remains faithful. His faithfulness remains steady. When things were going great, it didn't affect it. When things were going horribly wrong, it didn't affect it. Joseph remained faithful to God through it all. I think that's one of the great lessons we can learn from the life of Joseph. If we're being honest, sometimes as we live the Christian life, when things are great, maybe we begin to trust in ourselves a little bit more than we do in God. And then when things go wrong, maybe we cry out to God and say, why me? Why are you allowing this to happen? But we don't see that in the life of Joseph. Joseph's faith was steady through everything that was thrown at him. As we come to chapter 37, we begin in verse 1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. The author says on page 72 that a study of Jacob's life reveals that this was not always true, him dwelling in the land of Canaan. For several years, he says, Jacob lived outside of Canaan. Eventually, however, he made his way back from Padan Aram, 33:18, and dwelled first in the Promised Land. Regarding this fact, Selhammer noted, the writer's point is to show that the promises of God had not yet been completely fulfilled, and that Jacob, as his fathers before him, was still awaiting fulfillment. It is from a verse such as this the New Testament writers read the lives of the patriarchs as aliens and strangers on earth. Hebrews 11:13. The verse also provides a fitting transition to the next section, the Joseph narratives, which trace the course of events by which the sons of Jacob left the land of promise and entered the land of Egypt. And so Jacob is dwelling in the land of Canaan, but of course he's still a sojourner there. We noticed last week that they had left Shechem and moved into this area because of what took place in Shechem. And a lot of time has elapsed now. Joseph's been born, and of course we're going to see in the very next verse, Joseph's 17 now. And so a lot of history has taken place. The author in verse 2, or the Bible says in verse 2, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. The author on page 73 brings out a quote from a couple of individuals that really makes a lot of sense as you look at it, because we don't really know what this bad report was about and why it was given. He says, Kenneth O'Gangle and Stephen J. Brammer observed, whether this was a wise or needful action, the Scripture does not say. To call it tattling gives the impression of a poor motive or an unnecessary action. On the other hand, this behavior may have been a significant act that threatened the flock or Jacob's reputation among a people where he was without friend or ownership of land. What is important to note is that even as a young man of 17, Joseph was willing to speak against his brothers, although he must have been aware that the action could cost him dearly. And so they say, sometimes, and I've heard preachers say this, that the issue was he was tattling on them. Well, we're not told what the issue was. Could it have been that? Yeah, it could have been that Joseph was being petty about something. At the same time, though, it could have been that those sons were doing something that, as the authors said, threatened the reputation of Jacob or threatened the flock. And as such, it would be necessary for him to let his father know. Regardless, we see that Joseph was of such a character that he was willing to speak up. He was willing to speak out. He was willing to go against the grain if that was what was necessary. In verse 3 he says, Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made a tunic of many colors. The author said if Joseph speaking against his brothers didn't cause them to despise him, Jacob's favoritism of Joseph certainly did. We see Joseph obviously being favored here. We see this tunic of many colors. Brightly colored articles of clothing were something that they were expensive. The dyes that were needed to make them, and so this tunic of many colors, this was something that was special. And of course, by giving this only to Joseph, this would have elevated Joseph in a way, but also it would have caused his brothers to despise him as a result. And we see that in verse 4. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. And so we see that because of this favoritism, it creates a rift between Joseph and his brothers. And if that wasn't enough, we have him speaking out against his brothers. We have the favoritism of Jacob being shown. Then beginning in verse 5, we have the dreams that Joseph has, which further seeks to solidify this rift between him and his brothers. In verse 5, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear the dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Obviously, Joseph being towards the end of the birth order, it would have never been normally the case that he would have been one who would rule over his brothers. That was something that was normally reserved for the eldest. Of course, that didn't happen in the case of Jacob, because Esau sold his birthright, and then Jacob stole the blessing. But here we see Joseph having this dream, which appears to be a dream that's given to him from God. But we see that the brothers, once again, they hate him even more for what he's saying. Then in verse 9 he says, then he, Joseph, dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. On page 74 in the book, the author says, lost in the animosity is the truthfulness of Joseph's dreams. He did indeed rule over his family. Ross explained the first scene of the Joseph story, then relates how God sovereignly selected his future leader, and how that choice brought out the envy of those who would have to submit. Rather than recognize God's apparent choice through their father and through the divine revelation, the brothers set themselves on a course in which they would eventually try to destroy him. Thankfully, their efforts to destroy Joseph failed. And so God is showing them this is what's going to happen, but we're going to see that his brothers are going to try to stop that from happening. And that's another lesson we can learn from the life of Joseph, is that if God intends something to happen, friends, there's nothing that we're going to do that's going to change that. God's will is going to be done no matter what. And Joseph's life proves that. God had given him these dreams that he would rule over his family, and indeed that's what took place. As you continue through the narrative and we find him in Egypt, we find him right under Pharaoh, and we see his brothers coming and bowing down before him. And so just as God said it would happen, that's the way that it took place. Verse 12, then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am. Then he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron and went to Shechem. The journey here from the valley of Hebron to Shechem, this isn't a short trek that Joseph's going to go on. This is a 50-mile journey that he's about to undertake. And so his father's sending him to go and to check on his brothers. Now a certain man, verse 15, found him, and there he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? On page 75 in the book, the author says towards the bottom of the page, The text does not identify the man who helped Joseph. Gresham observed, the man's overhearing of the brothers' plan is one of the providential elements in the story. Interestingly, Jewish tradition identified the man as an angel. This is possible but uncertain. Earlier in the book, Abraham, Lot, and Jacob each encountered angels who appeared to be men. Upon learning Joseph sought his brothers, the man directed him to Dothan, another 13-mile journey. Dothan was on the international trade route that ran from the north down to Egypt. And so we see God's hand at work here. Joseph is seeking his brothers. He happens to run into an individual who just happens to know where his brothers are. And so Joseph now sets out for Dothan. He said, I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, they have departed from here. For I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Verse 18, now when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. And so we hear the vitriol, the hatred that they have towards Joseph. And we hear the plan that they've come up with. They're going to kill him. They're going to do away with him. They've decided they're going to put an end to those dreams. Those dreams that he had, they're not going to be fulfilled as far as they're concerned. Of course, as we see, God had other plans. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. And so Reuben has a plan here, and Reuben's hoping to be able to save Joseph and to take him back to his father. Reuben understands how much Joseph means to Jacob, and so we see of all of them, at least there's one brother who's somewhat thinking sensibly about the situation. In verse 23, so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Why strip him of that? Well, for one, it was a symbol of the favoritism that Jacob had towards him. For two, as we're going to see, they already had a plan to say that some wild beast had devoured him. We'll see that tunic comes into play in that plan towards the end of this chapter. And also, even if they weren't going to use it for that purpose, this tunic would have been worth a good deal of money, and so they also could have considered selling it. Verse 24, they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Once again, I would say that we have the providence of God taking place. It just so happens the pit they toss him in is a dry pit. Sometimes these pits would have water in them, and the individual would drown as a result of being cast in there. In verse 25, we're going to see what takes place, what happens to Joseph. And they sat down to eat a meal. That's always been an interesting sentence to me. Here they've taken Joseph, they've stripped him of his tunic. I would be willing to bet that Joseph didn't just willingly take it off and hand it to them. So I would assume that there was some scuffling and some fighting that took place. I'm going to assume that Joseph just didn't say, hey, I'll jump off in this pit if that's what y'all want me to do. So there was definitely an altercation that took place. All of this has happened, and then they sat down to eat a meal. We get a glimpse into their heart of how much they really could care less about Joseph. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. Look at how nice they're being. They said, hey, what profit is it if we just if we just kill him. That's not going to do us any good. Instead, let's sell him. We can get some money for him. And it's so interesting. We'll do that, and that way his blood won't be upon us. As if what they're doing absolved them of any of the wrong that they had done already up to this point. So this is the plan that they've set up. 28, then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Verse 29, then Reuben returned to the pit. Recall, Reuben, he had a plan. He had them cast him in the pit, and his plan was to return to the pit when they weren't around to retrieve Joseph, and then he was going to take Joseph back to Jacob in order to protect him. So Reuben returns to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. The tearing of clothes in the ancient Near East, this was a common practice to show great remorse. It could not just remorse, but anger. It was a show of great emotion. And that's what Reuben is showing here. And he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? So here we see the plan that they hatched. They take the tunic, they tear it up, they dip it in blood, and then they take it to Jacob and say, we found this. Do you know whether or not it is your son's tunic? Well, obviously he knew it was. This tunic of many colors was something that was special, and it was something that was, it wasn't like, just your everyday coat that anybody could have. This was something that wouldn't have been seen by, most people wouldn't have something like this. And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. The brothers didn't tell him that he had died. And so you might say, well, they didn't lie. Well, they led him to a conclusion that was false. That's just as bad. They're not guiltless in what has taken place here. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. A side note here that we learn from Jacob. Sincerity doesn't make something true. Did Jacob sincerely believe that Joseph was dead? Absolutely. He's tore his clothes. He's put sackcloth on. It talks about how he's mourned for his son. His sons and daughters sought to comfort him, and he refused to be comforted. And he makes this statement, I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Without a doubt, Jacob sincerely believed that Joseph was dead. But he was sincerely wrong. You see, his belief was based on false facts. The same is true in religion. Friends, we can be sincere in our beliefs, but if those beliefs are based on things that are not found in God's Word, then we can also be sincerely wrong. And so you'll hear the statement, and the reason I bring this up is this statement right here. You hear someone say, well, I just feel it in my heart. Well, no doubt Jacob felt in his heart that Joseph was dead, but Joseph was very much alive. As verse 36 says, now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. And so Joseph has made a journey now to Egypt, and he's been set upon a path that will eventually, after some ups and downs, some twists and some turns, will eventually find him as second in command under Pharaoh. That brings us to a couple of observations that the author gives us as we close out. He says, first of all, men do not always appreciate God's plans. Joseph's brothers despised him, because of his dreams, yet God was merely revealing how Joseph would play a key role in their salvation. When the brothers attempted to thwart Joseph's dreams, they actually expedited them. We would do well to remember that the God who revealed Joseph's dreams to him knows the end from the beginning. Those who fight against God will always lose. And so God's the one in control, and friends, we need to place our trust in him. The second application that he gives is the favoritism shown to Joseph caused unnecessary problems in Jacob's family. Jealousy and envy are to be avoided, not encouraged. Parents would do well to learn from Jacob's mistake and seek to do differently. That brings us to Lesson 8, which is where we will pick up next Sunday. Lesson 8 is entitled Joseph at Potiphar's House, and taken from Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 23. I hope you'll tune in then. Hope that there's been some things in this lesson that have been beneficial to you. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay holy, and I hope that you have a great day.